on this computer. And let us pray. Loving God, today we continue to explore Revelation and going through some images that are difficult for us to understand, and yet help us to gain a new understanding, to wrestle with the symbols that John of Patmos used to have us get a sense of what he was trying to say. And so surround us, we pray. Give us a spirit of learning that we might learn something new. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so here we go. We are almost, I was about to say we're almost at the end, and unfortunately that sort of, I inadvertently started on the last slide. So I'm going to just have to reshare that, reshare my screen. I thought I was on the first slide. There we go. So, so again, we are on week 6, and a week 6, we are dealing with a vision of hope. I'm hoping that this week and next week are dealing with some of the more hopeful imagery from Revelation, although the opening part of tonight is not, or it doesn't seem to be, at least on first read. So what does that look like? But I'm going to do a little bit of a recap from last week. Now, I am managing to keep up everything in terms of having the recordings and everything. But just in terms of where we've been, reminding us that the language in Revelation is symbolic. The numbers are all symbolic. Nothing. If something is literal in Revelation, it would be almost by accident, but everything that's included in the book, like it's a very deliberately written piece of work. So it's very, very heavy on the symbolism. And we've come through, and of course last week was pulling back the curtain and revealing the real players, who's behind all this. You kind of like, the Wizard of Oz moment of pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, whereas John of Patmos is Toto pulling that curtain back. And hope amidst darkness, or a vision of hope, is what is, and a vision of ultimate hope. That's today's subject. And then next week, which is the last session, is we are actually going to deal with chapter 22 next week, and then the broader topic of responsible interpretation of Revelation for the 21st century, and that is next week. There's also a certain bits of Stump the Minister. And now the trouble is, working with Revelation, Stump the Minister, you are far more likely to get an I don't know answer. That's kind of my rule. My rule is there's never a dumb question, and there's never a bad time to ask it. But understand that my answer could genuinely be I don't know. And that's my caveat. So just as a review for last week, for those of you who were here and those of you who weren't, of course, for those of you who weren't and want to go back and watch the whole thing, it's on YouTube. And the main thing to remember is chapters 12 through 14 form the core of Revelation's message, not necessarily the aspect of hope, but the point of, if you're wondering what Revelation is trying to reveal, chapters 12 through 14 is that pulling back of the curtain, and using in a symbolic and metaphoric way to describe something, and doing it in a very the degree of literary skill that John of Patmos has to be able to pull this off is quite astounding. But it's essentially, it is a verbal equivalent of a political cartoon. So of course we have the picture of the Grey Cup. There's also another one. Some of these, the trouble with political cartoons is they become out of date very, very quickly. So here's one, from an earlier time that I did this. is that that's George W. Bush behind the desk, not Joe Biden or any other president, and specifically and you know, he's looking at the resume, and it's of course like that's looking more like the Roman god of war, Mars, specific Mars or Ares, depending upon whether it's Greek or Roman. And you know, very impressive credentials. Too bad I just filled the Secretary of State position. Can you type? Is that caption there? And you know, it's intended to say something. But the idea is, as I said, this is Revelation uses language in the same way that a political cartoonist draws images. And the idea is that it uses the idea of using familiar images, things that people know, and then twisting them and recasting them as a way of making a political statement against the powers that be, and revealing their true nature. And so what we have in Revelation, and this is something is specifically if you don't have a lot of background in Greco-Roman mythology, there's a lot in Revelation you're going to miss, because it is so Christianity is such a minority tradition. Like they're pulling on things that people would know and understand. And there are elements of the story of Apollo, the birth of Apollo, and the just enmeshed in the language that's there, because Roman emperors often wanted to associate themselves with Apollo in the same way that politicians in Western countries often want to associate themselves with Jesus. And you know, it's the same sort of way. But what John of Patmos does is that he shifts that association, where the Roman emperors want to associate themselves with Apollo, the sun god, the one who brings prosperity, and uses the language and inverts it, that the Roman emperor is not affiliated with, not to be associated with the Apollo, but rather the dragon that is the dragon that, at least in the Apollo myth, of course, Hera sends Python to kill the child, the child Apollo, but you know, Apollo is born safely, and then, you know, in indeterminate amount of time, turns around and slays Python the dragon. And the idea is that what this does is it inverts that, and then associates the dragon itself is the embodiment of evil. It's just, you know, and very, you know, at this point almost specifically named, that the dragon is to be understood as the diabolical power. And then the beast imagery symbolizes the subjugation of religious authority to Roman political authority, beast from the earth, beast from the sea. And by identifying those powers, it gives people encouragement. This is who you're really facing. And so therefore, it gives them encouragement to resist that authority rather than to give into it. And then, but it also does give a sense of warning. It's that resistance to Roman authority, and this also marks historically a real shift, because in Romans, I believe it's chapter 13, at the time, Paul was very much Paul himself was actually pro-Rome. It seemed that, you know, well, Rome, you know, God has given them the power, and therefore that that authority should be respected. Whereas by the time that we get to Revelation, Well, first off, one of the things that Paul wasn't aware of when he wrote Romans 13 is that he was going to lose his head to the Romans. And so one does not have the opportunity to change one's opinion when you still have your head. And you can't do it after you lose it because, well, you kind of need your head to write. And so would have Paul changed his opinion? Probably. And so what you then have is this struggle amongst early Christianity is, how do we deal with imperial authority? And Revelation comes down on a very clear, very anti-Roman or anti-imperial approach. And one of the questions, curiously enough, that Paul wrestled with early on is that in some places, is it okay for us to eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols? And Paul's answer was very much, well, if you know, the answer is yeah, you don't. But if you're unaware, you're not going to be struck by lightning. But if you're aware, please, like it's not a good idea. It's not a good idea. But generally, for the most part, he sees this kind of it is like he's sort of kind of playing it. Whereas very clearly, is it bad for Christians to participate in Roman imperial worship? And the answer for John of Patmos is absolutely do not. Because this is what you're submitting to. That's that mark of the beast that you're going to be struggling against. And the idea is that once that curtain is pulled back, then it's like, okay, here's who the real players are. And then it moves into that last set of judgment images. So in other words, the judgment is happening to the powers that are revealed in 12 to 14. And that's where we get into the next part. The other thing is also in that cycling out, remember the seals and the trumpets kind of cycle us into that central moment. The bowls that are mentioned in Revelation 5, the pouring out of the 7 bowls that form a similar pattern, you have the three groups of 7. That pouring out is also, remember earlier in the book, like, how long do we have to sit around and wait for this? Well, this is the answer to that prayer. So it's not just sort of rhetorical back there. It's like, okay, here's the answer to that prayer, and this is what it looks like, and it looks an awful lot like the various plagues of Egypt, and they get more and more intense until the people are freed. Remember that the last plague was the what precipitates this the celebration of Passover. Why is it called Passover? Well, because they were to have this ritual of a lamb slaughter and put the blood on the door frame, and the Spirit of God would come down, and if they saw the blood on the door frame, they would pass over it. But if they didn't, the Spirit of God would go in and take the firstborn. And it was the death of the firstborn in those plagues of Egypt, and that was the final one before the slaves were freed. And so that Revelation relies heavily on that plague imagery, that ultimately it's moving people towards freedom. But there's also this part here about the anticipated fall of Babylon. Now, Babylon does not mean Babylon, the ancient city near Baghdad. Babylon, as we explored the symbol before, Babylon is a metaphor for Rome. And so the anytime Babylon comes up, and Christians actually started to use the phrase, even in 1 Peter and a few other places, that the word that Babylon became the word for the word for Rome. Now, here's an interesting thing. When I served in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the national office was at the address was 50 Winifred Drive in Don Mills in Ontario, in the Greater Toronto area. More often than not, I heard many colleagues refer to 50 Winford Drive, like 50 Winford was often what we referred to it, but they often called it the Vatican. The thing is it the real Vatican? No, but it was the national office of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and it was used in that sort of pejorative way because sometimes sometimes they felt as if they kind of operated more on a dictatorial sort of thing, because put it this way, Presbyterians using the term Vatican to describe their own national office, there's a certain streak of anti-Catholicism that would run through the Presbyterian Church in Canada that goes back many years, and even if it was used in jest, there's that kind of streak. So Babylon is used in that same sort of way, and so the fall of Babylon is basically set between the pouring out of the bowls and the vision of last things, which is 19 to 21, which we are covering tonight. But this is the one where it's like, oh, this is ugly. But let's keep going. So what this does is it explores the metaphor of what Babylon is, and and the idea is that, of course, we already understood Babylon as a metaphor for Rome, but John spins it further, because Christians were using it, so it wasn't novel for John to use it, but then John takes it and really starts to work with it, and then we get this whole Whore of Babylon. This kind of this imagery, and like, oh my, like, what do we do with this? Like this is like, it's and the idea is that the whore of Babylon not only evokes this image of locating Babylon as Rome, but also the sense of the spirit of, and you're going to see how this hope plays. So let's do a little bit of backtracking a little bit. So both, like many cities themselves, have there's a certain ethos, like, technically I was born and raised as a Calgarian, and so that is part of my historical identity. Rome and Athens are both cities that are named after goddesses, Athena and Roma. And so you have these cities that themselves bear the name of a goddess. And Rome and Athena are like functionally, like, there is a lot of parallels and overlays between Greek mythology and Roman mythology, like Zeus, Jupiter, some of them retain the same names, and like Apollo retains the same name, whereas Rome, or Roma, and Athena are the same ones, the Great Mother. So keep that in mind as we're kind of working, and so from a nationalistic perspective, the idea is that the city itself is the embodiment of the Great Mother, the one whose wisdom and protective power and nurtures, and the idea of motherhood. It's a way of evoking national identity. We have it less so in North America, but it is kind of that there. But for example, Russia would frequently use the description of the motherland, and of course infamously during the Second World War, the fatherland. And the idea is that there's this kind of family association of the city and the empire itself is the embodiment of that kind of relationship, but that is associated directly with the goddess, this goddess that protects them. And so the idea is associating Rome, as in not necessarily the city, but the goddess associated over it, and calling your mother a whore is intentionally insulting here. Okay. And very, very, but the idea is that that this whore of Babylon, the Rhine and the Beast is this evoking the downfall. Ultimately, what we're seeing here is what it's pointing towards is the downfall of Rome. Now, that having been said, I mean, Rome as an imperial power would remain in power for another 300 years after this. So this is more John of Patmos saying that ultimately this will this will end. Babylon will fall. But there's sort of an interesting turn of events, that what happens here is that Babylon turns on itself and is defeated and consumed by the very forces that were originally as allied with her. Where we have here, so 15 through 18. And he said to me, the waters you saw where the whore is seated, and the people in the multitudes and nations and languages, and the 10 horns you saw, and the beast that they hate, and the beast will hate the whore. In other words, that were mentioned before. And they will make her desolate and naked, and they will devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put into their hearts and carry out this purpose by agreeing to the kingdom of the beast, until the words of God will be fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. The great, and there's basically, just if you didn't already know, that's Rome. But the thing is that all these kind of powers that be, ultimately itself consumes. And the idea is one of the major plot points for Revelation is that evil ultimately defeats itself. It is self-defeating. It is so by extension, ultimately imperial power is self-defeating, because all those conquered lands will eventually turn on it. And in this particular case, it turned out to be predictive, because of course even though the Roman Empire itself did not technically fall until 1458, when the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman Turks, the Rome as a political power and the Western Church didn't survive past 300 years after Revelation was written. And oddly enough, it was like various regions, it sort of it destroyed itself. And the idea is that the imperial power will ultimately destroy itself. That's the thesis that John puts forward to it. But you see, John isn't entirely happy with that situation, because all of a sudden there's this lament. It's not a celebration. There is actually a genuine lament when Babylon falls. And the idea is that, despite all this negative portrayal, all of a sudden we then have Babylon being mourned. In chapter 18, and it's like, okay, well, how do we get our heads around this? And so perhaps one way to understand it is that it's a lament of the waste of human potential, that Rome is so busy glorifying itself that ultimately when it falls, it could have been so much more, and it wasn't. And so the idea is that it laments what went wrong, like what could have been and what could be. So there is not there's no Schadenfreude here, if you understand. How many people here know what Schadenfreude means?
I don't.
Okay. Schadenfreude is a wonderful German word that has no English equivalent, but it is taking pleasure in somebody else's misfortune. Now, curiously enough, I've actually preached a sermon saying that as Christians, we should not exercise Schadenfreude. It's not a good stance. And so, curiously enough, here you don't see that. You don't see this taking pleasure in Rome's fall, but it's a lament for what could have been, and rather than taking any degree of pleasure in it. So, it happens to bring people towards freedom, but it's not to be celebrated. And so one of the things that I often try to be careful of is this kind of gleefulness of when seeing something fall. And admittedly, it's hard, but what we have here is this sense of, even though this is the power that we've been working so hard against, that we don't, to celebrate its downfall is not what we should be doing. Lamenting it, on the other hand, would be appropriate, because it's a waste of human potential. So, but after this, then then we start moving into this redemption, and the redeeming of the holy city. Now, the whole thing carries us right up to the end of right up to the end of chapter 22. Now we're doing mostly to 21. We'll do we're going to kind of come back to 22 more next week. But what happens is at the beginning of chapter 19, where are we here? Is of course this rejoice. There is a rejoicing in heaven. It's not that what we have here is, yes, there's this lament, and then it is a celebration of God's victory, kind of. Well, but it's more complex than that. But we have this return to the heavenly throne room, and what we have here is the words that directly inspired Handel's Hallelujah chorus. In what we have in halfway through chapter, or verse 6. Hallelujah, for the Lord our God Almighty reigns. Let's rejoice and exult, give him the glory. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, like if you, this is where you are hearing the Hallelujah chorus. And what this does is this kind of closes the bracket, and we have the lament, and then we have this praising of God from in chapter 19 verses 1 through 10. And so we have this great celebration. But the thing is, we still have the rest of chapter 19, all of chapter 20, all of chapter 21, and then chapter 22. So we're not done yet. This isn't the end, but there is a celebration here. Also, there's a little bit of a note here that there is a rebuke to the prophet of, don't, angels are not to be worshipped. And then we now have the 7 visions of the end. And remember how these things are grouped together. And once you start seeing these patterns, they tend to jump out a little bit more. But these are the 7 visions of the end, of which we won't do all of them, because but we have what is called the parousia, or parousia, depending on how your Greek is pronounced. You have the last battle. Notice some of these are actually pretty short. Like, we've got five verses for the parousia. We only have the 4 verses for the last battle. We have 3 verses for the dragon or Satan bound. We have 2 verses for the millennium. The defeat of Gog and Magog, the last stand, is only 3 verses. The last judgment at verse, for chapter, is 4 verses. So like, this is not very long at all. And then we have this extensive 2-chapter description of the New Jerusalem. So in other words, these 7 visions of the end just kind of like go rapid fire, and then it's at and the last one is, okay, now we're going to take our time with this. But right now we're going to take our time with the first one. So let's have a look. The idea is, remember, things are not sequential in Revelation. They are diachronic. They are not synchronic. In other words, they don't. It's not this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. It's all of this is kind of happening at once. It's just when you're writing it down, or sort of presenting it, it does happen in a certain order. But there's not this is not a specific sequence that this happens to have. This first, this next, etc. And all of it is literary. And so these are all expressions of, and I apologize for this word, and I'm going to explain it, eschatology. Now, how many of you have heard of this word before? Fred, you don't? Well, okay, Fred gets to put his hand up. Because, all right, yeah, Fred put his hand up, and because it means, it is from the Greek word eschaton, which means the ultimate, and the study of the ultimate. In other words, the ultimate purpose, the end of something, like the end. But the thing is, like, we have the end in terms of the end of the road, but also, if you've heard the phrase, to what end? In other words, for what purpose?
Yeah.
And it means both. That what, sort of, where does this all go? But what is the ultimate purpose of it? And so eschatology is the study of ultimate purpose, specifically within, and it's a theological term. And what is that ultimate meaning? And and quite often it's kind of the 800-pound. It's the elephant in the room. It's like Revelation is talking about what is our ultimate purpose? Where is it all going? What does it all mean? What is the meaning of life? Yeah. And Brad 42, I beat you to it. But the idea here is we have what is this all heading towards? But it's also a matter of time. And here's the trouble: English is a very versatile language. It borrows a lot, it uses a lot. The trouble is, there are certain things that we get trapped into certain definitions because we have very limited understandings of certain things. Like and part of it is when we describe time in English, like, we've got one word that can mean a whole bunch of different things. We're not necessarily sure of what that necessarily means. On the other hand, words like Greek, Greek has many different words for love, for example.
Yeah.
And it also has many different words for time. And so, for example, the time that we tend to work with is chronos. In other words, sequential time. And the main mistake that we make with Revelation is that we interpreted the word, and actually for anywhere in the Bible where the word time appears, we tend to think of it as chronos. In other words, something that happens in sequential time. And the temptation to set dates for Christ's return, for example, is making this fundamental mistake of assuming that it's chronos, time as we understand it. In other words, the sequential time. But the trouble is, chronos is only ever used in 4 places in Revelation. But there are other words for time. We have hora, where we get the word hour or season. In other words, the cycle of time. Because like when you say winter, winter represents a season during the year. I mean, that's an example of a seasonal form of time that we talk about. And I mean, yes, I realize we are technically in fall. It just looks like winter comes to mind. But there's much more the use of this language of the hour or season. In other words, the cycle of time that we experience. So when I say in winter, you kind of get the sense of like there's sort of this picture that can be removed. But you know, depending on how old we are, we've experienced, like, you know, Ian at 8 years old has experienced 9 winters. Okay, but we still refer to winter more broadly as a season, as in terms of stuff that generally happens in winter. You know, is similarly in the Christian calendar, Advent is a season, not necessarily this particular Advent or, you know, next year's Advent. It's the season that we're working with, and that appears 10 times. And then we also have this other word called kairos, which means the right time or God's time. And particularly anytime that we talk about the coming of Christ or the coming of God, the word that the phrase that is used in Greek is this word, kairos. And kairos is not sequential time at all. It means it is effectively, it is eternity in the moment. The Gospel of John, for example, often uses the idea is that eternity is not just really long forever. Eternity is a time. There's a timelessness to it. It is God's time. And so there's that sense. And the trouble is, most of us kind of get in our heads, eternity is just chronos, really, really long. Infinitely long, whereas kairos is God's time, the fulfillment of time, the fullness of time. And it's not even something that we can easily get our head around, because we are very much locked into, we wear watch. Well, I don't wear a watch, but I have an iPhone that tells me what time it is, and just sequences it up that way. Whereas kairos is a much more broad, like think cosmic time here, and not only that, for John of Patmos, the end, the purpose, that ultimate meaning is not a what, but who. Clear as mud?
John and is not something but somewhat.
Yeah, it is not what, but who. And the who, but just spoiler alert, the who is God. Anyway, let's talk about the parousia, or the parousia, or however you pronounce it. Literally, it means the presence, or the presence of Christ. Sometimes this is referred to as the, quote, second coming of Christ. The trouble is that the second coming, well, like, okay, well, he came once. He was born in the born as we understand. We're preparing for that for Christmas. But then there was a resurrection. The resurrection technically is the second coming, if you really want to do your math there, because he was dead and then he came back. So I suppose you could call this, but the idea is that it's often taken as the return of Christ, which is not entirely accurate, because it's not like Christ is out there someplace, like has gone away and we're waiting for it. It has more to do with the idea of the presence of Christ in our midst in a more substantive way. This is an intentional contrast. The rider on the white horse is intentionally in contrast to the one on the pale horse from in Revelation 6. So we have that. Then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True. In righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like flames of fire. It goes on to this extensive description, and you have this almost impossible, and his name is called the Word of God, Logos, that we have in this. And so we have the power of the Word of God. So that sword imagery from chapter 1, again, it kind of repeats itself, and the rod from chapter 12. So it's not only is it pulling from the Old Testament here, but it's also pulling back from earlier parts, or where John is weaving these together. Then we have the last battle, but notice I put the battle in quotes, because it kind of cycles back briefly into judgment to make something clear. The idea is that you have the beasts and the kings of the earth kind of gathering together, and it talks about the last battle, but no battle is actually described. There's no combat. There's no combat described at all. Christ has already won. Because if you look, they're arrayed. Saw an angel standing in the sun with loud voice. He called to all the birds and the fly in mid-heaven. Okay, come the great supper of God. By the way, here's Ian, and if you want to look at his forehead, and in profile you can see the bump. Okay.
Can you keep me up until 9?
8:30 if you can. Okay. Maybe. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. Can you close the door, please? We'll work on it. 8:30. Sorry, the door is closed, but he's been kind of clingy too. So anyway, there's no real battle. It says, I saw the beasts and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against the rider on the horse and his army. And then all of a sudden, like there's no battle described. The beast was captured, and the false prophet who had performed the presence of the signs, that's all taken care of. They're just arrested, and then they're taken and thrown into this infamous lake of fire. And we're going to get to the lake of fire in a little bit. Okay. So then we have this image of the dragon / Satan getting bound, and the idea is that this evokes that Near Eastern, Iranian, Persian myth, but also that Babylonian myth of of Tiamat. So you've got multiple mythologies working on top of each other here. And the idea is a single angel shows up and just simply loops the chain, like runs the chain around the dragon and binds it up, with a key. There's not a lot of effort here. There's no great battle described or anything like that. It's because if you think of, that would be a really great action sequence in a film, it doesn't happen. It just all of a sudden there's a dragon and the dragon's chained up. Okay, what happened? Well,
Magic.
The whole idea is that it's effortless. The defeat of these powers is effortless, it seems. And the idea is that, as dramatic as it is, the power of evil is temporary, it is limited, that God's power is far, like, this isn't like a Zoroastrian idea of a good God and a bad God fighting it out with each other. Okay. That evil is already defeated and always has been. Then we get this very, ironically, 1,000-year reign, only 3 verses, very short. And the idea is that evil is overcome. The world reaches the potential that is they hope it to be. Now, what happens here is that John, of course, remember, every single one of this, there are so many references into the Old Testament, never mind into Greek popular culture and Persian mythology and everything else, just being pulled all in. Is that specifically we get this image from Ezekiel, and actually Revelation relies fairly heavily on Ezekiel from here through to the end of the book. And the idea is that we have this speaking about the restoration of Israel. So not only do we have the imagery from Exodus about the freeing of the slave, we also have this parallel of the restoration of Israel from exile. And the idea is that moves towards the restoration of Jerusalem. Now, Ezekiel had some pretty grand plans about what this would look like, and we're going to get to that when we deal with the new Jerusalem, and in chapter 21. We'll get to that in a second. Well, we're going to take a couple laps at it, but the idea is that Ezekiel relies on that. Whoops. And then we have the defeat of Gog and Magog, and I mean, like words like Gog and Magog have this kind of menacing phrase to it. And this, and when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations in the 4 corners of the earth. Again, here it's almost explicit, just all Gog and Magog, in order to gather them for battle. In other words, we keep have this gathering for battle, and the idea is that again, there's parallels here with Ezekiel. Now, keep in mind, I'm we're still at orbital view here. Like we're not getting too much. We can't. To get into the weeds is to do a PhD on 3 verses, sort of thing. But the idea is that, from a literary sense, is just in case you hadn't figured it out, that Satan's defeated. Well, here we go again, and it's just how effortless the defeat of evil is from God's perspective. From God's perspective, and the idea is that, and this, they gather for battle again. Just they were gathering for battle before, then they were defeated and bound, and then gather for battle again, and then evil is and get this. And fire came down from heaven and consumed them. Just out they go. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were. They, and we have this torment. But curiously enough, it's this. Isn't the devil the one who's actually supposed to be in the supervisor of that lake of fire? It's kind of like and there, and tormented night and day forever and ever, which is kind of funny because in the judgment, like forever doesn't seem to be like forever in terms of a long time, because curiously enough, here we are in the last judgment, that everyone's gathered around the throne. 2 sets of books, not 1, 2. First one is a book of deeds. In other words, from John's perspective, what we do in life is important. It is. there's a backup plan, because then you have the book of grace, the book of life. And the idea is that ultimately it's God that saves us. Revelation is actually, even though it sounds kind of judgy and exclusionary, its core theology is actually much more universal, that all are redeemed. And here we have, there's a line in Guide Me, O the Great Jehovah, in when I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears subside. Death of death and hell's destruction, land me safe on Canaan's side. No, death of death and hell's destruction. It's here. This is it. And ultimately, death and hell are gone. Like it says, death and Hades. But ultimately, death and Hades give up the dead that were in them, and they were all judged according to when they're done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. And the idea is, and anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. But it already makes a point of the only ones that aren't are death and Hades. And then the new heaven and new earth comes, and all of a sudden that lake of fire goes bye-bye. Because and actually I can't believe I moved through this a little quicker than I thought. So I was wrong. I'm saving chapter 21 and 22 for next week. Yeah. Because the discussion of the New Jerusalem, that seventh vision, because there's a lot to unpack in that, because these 7 visions of the end, we've gone through 6 of them. We're fairly rapid fire. Now, I have certainly lots of time for questions, but just ahead of next week, what I want you to do is read chapter 21 and 22. But I want you to compare it to Ezekiel chapter from 40 through 43 out to possibly chapter 44 in Ezekiel. In other words, read the last 2 chapters of Revelation, but then 3 chapters from Ezekiel. And I want you to compare them. Because John is reliant on that. So, okay. Now, I can jump back to any slide, any questions that you may have. Here's an interesting little tidbit of truth. I could probably have done all of Revelation in 6 sessions, which is why this one feels a little short. But it just seemed appropriate to do Revelation over 7 sessions. So there's a intentional symbolism even in the planning of it. But it also gives us more time for questions and discussion. So I mean, I've thrown a lot at you. Is there anything that you wanted me to kind of go back and cover or discuss a little bit more? Mm-hmm. Or should I go back to the beginning and okay, let's review, go back through one more time. I mean part of it is like certain images, let's be honest, the images of the Whore of Babylon is difficult for us to hear, particularly like it, that sounds insulting, it sounds terrible. I don't want my kids hearing that, for example. And it genuinely sounds offensive. Well, actually, John of Patmos intended it to be offensive, because effectively he is calling the essence of Rome the great mother protector, and here John says, no, she's not a mother, she's a harlot, a prostitute, which is not exactly flattering, especially if one has as a degree of the it'd be it'd be like describing Uncle Sam, that image of the United States as a pimp, which there are some political commentators that might say, yeah, that we could work with that. But that's how insulting John is intentionally being towards imperial authority and the dangers of imperial powers. And I think this goes back to Betty again, the one thing that you had brought up, that association with and this is again we're starting to lean into that discussion now, but it's also that one next time about the dangers of imperial powers. And so you can actually see this kind of you can go back through whether it's the Spanish Empire, whether it is like for a time France was dominant. That's where we get the term lingua franca, because the common trade language. And then of course English now is the common trade language in the world today, largely thanks to the British Empire, and then by the American. The United States does not call itself an empire, but it is an imperial power because of its ability to project its power so far across around the world. It's just it doesn't do it does it in a different way, but at the same time, the United States has territorial holdings well beyond the continent, its continental borders. David, I thought I saw your hand up.
No, no, that was for something else, I guess.
Well, was it something else for this, or?
Well, yeah, I read 17 through 21.
Yeah.
And I thought you covered it well, but I'd like to, sort of thing that I'd like to read over again.
Mm-hmm.
The message ultimately, I guess I won't use the Greek word, I don't know it, but the hope at the end, talking about, it's the death of death.
Yes.
It's the death, suffering, all of that is gone.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mention anything further about Babylon, because Babylon is gone too.
Yeah.
Now, any form of Babylon is supposedly gone.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point that really after actually here, I'm going to pull this up because I believe that's I'm gonna have a look here. I just need to kind of hide things out of the way. Is that Babylon is mentioned 7 times in Revelation, and the last time it's mentioned is verse 21 in chapter 18. And so you're right, from chapter 19 on through to the end of the book, Babylon isn't mentioned at all.
So it also, I think it indicates that God's kingdom is then with us.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if it's right on earth, but it's as though we are part of that kingdom now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like this is more the next week. more the next week discussion. Now, because Revelation is concerned with what is currently happening in the present and acknowledges the present. But what happens, we're in this kind of transitional point where we move out of the present, ultimately that imperial powers will fall, and now there's this expression of hope, the hope to come, but the hope that is potentially already realized. That we can be, so it's not like we're, because that's where we get lost in that kind of chronos, that we think that God's time is something that is chronological, that'll happen, that we just have to keep waiting for it chronologically, as opposed to it is part of the fullness of time, that even though the powers that be are still there and doing whatever it is that they're doing, they ultimately do not have the final say over who we are. So
the expression of God's time strikes me as particularly relevant in talking about that form of time.
Yes. And again, it's something that's quite often lost on us, because we are so enmeshed in chronological time that that we have certain hours that we have to be at work. We have certain time frame there. We have the appointments that we have. I have a Google Calendar that is all chronological time. There's a little bit of cyclical, because of course it works by weeks, like Monday is an example of a cyclical time expression, whereas Monday the 12th happens to be my daughter's birthday. We do deal with these kind of cyclical things, but we tend to lock far more into the chronos time, as opposed to the fullness of time. And I mean, Christmas is one of these things that is an expression of the fullness of time. It's the coming of God, not just back then as a baby, but the coming of God in the midst of us. For example, we will sing on Christmas Eve, "Joy to the world, the Lord is come." Okay. Curiously enough, if you look really, really carefully, as much as we associate that as a Christmas carol, look at their lyrics. It is not exclusively a Christmas carol. It can be sung at any time during the year.
Yeah.
But we tend to sing it at Christmas, because we tend to think of it as being a Christmas carol. But it is an example. Joy to the world, the Lord has come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing. That's actually Revelation. I've been halfway tempted to pull it out every once in a while. Like it works very well for Reign of Christ. It actually works quite well with, in some respects, the Pentecost. It works well for Easter. So trouble is, if I keep trotting it out, you might think I'm nuts.
I like it in the middle of summer when it's hot, and it makes me feel cooler. I'm thinking of
because
Christmas.
you associate it with snow. I see that. I see that. Marilyn, you have your hand up.
I have a question.
Yep.
All right, we're talking about throwing them into the fiery lake and the
Yes.
burning sulfur and that.
Yeah.
Well, would that associate where the Roman Catholics get going to hell and burning, that be where they would get that from?
Well, not just Roman Catholics. There are some pretty good Baptists that really use that lake of fire quite well. The trouble is that they've equated the lake of fire with hell.
Yeah.
And Revelation doesn't make that connection. The lake of fire is sort of like this, almost like this burn pit of where things are eliminated. As a and curiously enough, the where we have here, like, there's this interesting contrast, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire. The devil, supposedly the ruler of hell, gets hucked into this lake of fire. And so what you have, like, it's more along the lines of it, think of it like almost like a, keep in mind, none of this is literal. This is all metaphorical. It is it's effectively this means of the where it all gets consumed. But here's the interesting thing: that lake of fire kind of shows up in a couple places, sort of in these chapters. At 21, it's all gone, because then I saw a new heaven and new earth, and like, it's gone, like gone. But that's next week.
In a way, I've seen it reinterpreted as the lake of destruction. And in my imagination, I'm thinking also, the ancients didn't know about black holes, but if they did, maybe they would have used a term like that.
Yeah, entirely possible. I mean, there are examples of places in the world where you actually have, like, for example, I don't know if I can't remember what it's actually called. I don't almost have to look it up here. The Darvasa gas crater, and it's a natural gas field in Turkmenistan, sometimes referred to as the door of hell, or the and if you look up this, you actually, honestly, if you do a search on the door to hell or the gate of hell, you can actually see this interesting image of it, where it's actually, an example of a pit that there's a natural gas reserve underneath it that fell, and somehow it got on fire. And so you actually have this perpetually burning pit that's a natural phenomenon. Now, that having been said, John of Patmos would not have been anywhere close to something like this. The closest analogy, that real world analogy that he probably would have worked with, is all the volcanoes that are in and around this area of the Mediterranean, the Aegean Sea, and the like. I mean, everything there is largely like you have these various places, and of course, Italy was well known for its volcanoes. I mean, one of the little interesting little bits that I'm always curious about is how much did the eruption of Vesuvius in and around this, because it was in and around this period, have an impact on some of that imagery, and the destruction of Pompeii, for example. Would it have had? And the answer is, I don't know. It may have, but at the same time, John of Patmos wrote this a good 20 plus years after that particular event. But there could be some of that at play. I can't say definitively, because there were so few survivors of it. Not a lot of people. There were some who were able to describe it, but generally, if you were anywhere close to it, you were dead.
But I think Marilyn was actually right when it came to the Catholic part of hell and fire.
Yes.
Just because I think it was Pope John Paul who had to try and clarify that. in that hell, as far as he was concerned, was to be the furthest distance away from God,
Yes.
whereas heaven was to be so close to him that that was the difference, because people that still believed that hell was below you and that
Mhm.
heaven was above still did not, especially with Catholics, did not get that full concept of that.
Oh yeah, and I mean, one of the interesting things about that is that a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of the theology that Roman Catholics and by extension Protestants developed in terms of this heaven hell imagery has more to do with Dante
Mm,
than it does with actually anything biblical.
yeah.
And so there's a lot, and there's and I mean, and all Dante was doing was actually putting into words the various sort of things that had been woven up of this, you know, and I mean, the Greeks, for example, the concept of Sheol or Hades, like it was the living place of the dead, and that sort of evolved into this place where, well, living place of the dead, but with a lot of fire, you know,
Hades.
and so like there's a complex history of the development of the concept of hell, and you know, my son is probably you know, like, hell's a swear word, Dad.
And it's 4 letters.
He's not wrong. Actually, there was one point in time where I was actually as a survivor of the ice storm in Eastern Ontario, we actually had a group of students from Alabama come up and actually help clear things in the aftermath. And as a thank you, I went down to Alabama to speak at, you know, I was speaking at some of the churches and described some of the events, and I actually used the phrase "all hell broke loose." Apparently that like me using that particular phrase was like again, culture shock, because like it's like, you know, and I couldn't even say HE double hockey sticks because they didn't play hockey. So you know, going back to that hockey metaphor again. Anyway, David, you have your hand back up.
Yeah. One other reference in Greek is the term Hades
Yes.
for hell.
Yes.
But then they have this curious river Styx.
Yeah, well, in Greek mythology, yes, you know,
Yes.
and Charon and paying the boatman and all that kind
Exactly.
of
So
fun
I was
stuff.
wondering if that turns up in some way in Jewish or Christianity or
Well, I mean,
Or-
here's the interesting thing is that if you look up the word river, and the word river appears 8 times in Revelation, and you know, sometimes you have like the where we have here river, and then you have the river of life, but curiously enough, it doesn't seem to be like an equivalent to the river Styx, like just doing a quick look, and something that you have to cross in order to get to. I'm not seeing that, but you know, now here's an interesting an interesting point. Anytime you see and here's one of these translational things. The New Testament does not actually have the word hell in it. It has Hades.
Yes.
Okay. And so that like it is using the Greek term of this underworld. In Hebrew, the word is Sheol, the residing place of the dead.
I'm wondering if it refers to an emotion. like a negative emotion about yourself if you are doing evil?
Actually, Cheryl, believe it or not, that's a little segue preview of of some of the stuff we're going to talk about next week. And no, and that's a good thing. I'm not saying don't, don't hold on to that thought, because that is part of the discussion for next week, particularly when it comes to some of the darker natures of humanity.
Yeah.
As opposed to, because it's separating that out from the individuals.
Yeah.
So like you're not wrong.
No. It's part of the symbolism, I think, as
Mhm.
well, and inside every person's mind.
Yeah.
You can cross the barrier. You might even call it, that's the river Styx that you're crossing.
Mhm.
To go from the light to the darkness.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And now, I mean, that having been said, I mean, there are certain things, like one of the things we have to be careful of is we don't take modern perceptions of like modern understandings of psychology and the like and project it back onto this, because it wasn't written with that frame in mind. However, at the same time, there are certain elements of that are actually transferable, for lack of a better term. But that's actually part. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. We're that's for next week.
Right.
But do hold on to it and bring it back up.
Yeah.
When
I was growing up, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I was just saying it's hard to keep all of the symbolism straight when you're reading it through if you don't know a lot about the ancient history.
Oh yeah, and that's one of the major barriers to understanding Revelation, is that there's a whole lot of context here that we just simply don't have. Even if you were to go in and get a PhD in Roman culture and mythology, you'd still miss other stuff, because it's kind of like sometimes when you're in the same way that a fish does not know it's in water. Okay. It's just what they're breathing. And so when John is writing this, he's writing in the water of the time.
Yeah.
Just like when we have a whole bunch of things like I've kind of hypothesized is if you took a transcript of Foster Hewitt, for example, going back several decades, in a hockey broadcast, like a transcript of a hockey broadcast, say 10,000 years from now, and the game of hockey no longer exists, or it's evolved into something else, how would people actually read and understand that?
Yeah.
And in the same way, we're trying to do the same thing. So anyway, Betty, you had a question.
No, it's okay.
Or not so much a question. I think you were mentioning something.
I was just going to go back to swear words.
Mm.
When I grew up in our household, the two swear words we were never allowed to use was the word hate or the word shut up.
Interesting.
Uh-oh.
Mhm.
Yeah. Which might explain something why. Here's a little bit of trivia for you. When Jesus is on, Jesus is on the boat, and the storm is raging, and the disciples say, "Jesus, get up! Do you not care that we're drowning?" And he kind of gets up, and most translations that we have says, "Peace, be still," and the waters are stilled.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, what he actually says, proper Greek translation, is he yells, "Shut up."
Yeah, you woke me up.
and that's kind of like, oh yeah. And the thing is, I mean, I remember once using that in a sermon in a context that the cultural context that I wasn't aware of, and it was like, why, and it like went over like a lead balloon, and so there are certain things about that, and I actually thank you, Betty, that's actually helped me reconcile something that happened to me about 20 years ago.
Oh, good.
So it's like, okay, maybe that's what I tripped over. Because there are like even there are cultural differences even amongst generations that live in the same area, and the various conventions and the languages that are used, and just trying, barely keeping up with the jargon that our kids or our grandkids use. Like, what are they saying? And more often than not with certain kids, like they're talking about a game or a show or something like that requires it. I actually, curiously enough, a similar metaphor. I was talking to Richard today. On Sunday in my sermon, I talk about I worked retail during my undergraduate degree, and I worked at a game store, and whether it was puzzles or all different kinds of puzzles, card games, role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, all those kinds of things, we sold them at the store.
At Market Mall.
At Market Mall, Chesson Games
I know
Galore.
the store.
Yep. I was one of the, if you were in there when it was open, I was in there because I was there when it opened and I was there when it closed. So you may have met me at that point.
Could be.
And anyway, so I was in at Chesson Games Galore, and but in all that time, I never learned how to play euchre. I never learned how to play bridge. Even though we sold it. I mean, I can play poker. I can do poker. Poker, I get. Poker, I understand. But things like euchre, and the people, euchre is easy, and then they would try and explain it, but they explain it in a way that assumes you already know how to play it, because there's a whole jargon set around euchre. And so I play the most complex games around, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or any number of the so-called Euro board games that I have that have thick rule books. Play them, no problem. Euchre, still over my head.
And there's only 5 cards.
I know, and I still don't get it. And my brother knows how to. My brother knows how to play it. He plays it every week.
Okay, so John of Patmos wrote Revelation back in whatever.
Yeah, between 90 and 95, roughly.
Okay, so has anybody rewritten it that you would suggest would be an authentic rendition using today's symbolism that would genuinely bring forth the original intention?
It would be extraordinarily difficult to do that, because it's entirely contextual. Because of course, you could write something that might work in North American culture.
Yeah.
Something that might work in but it wouldn't, but it directly would not work in say it wouldn't work in Zimbabwe or China, because a lot of it's also locally relevant. And so sometimes I try and pay attention to political cartoons and political discussions. I mean, I as much as I follow politics, like for example, my Twitter feed gives me Indian politics, for example, that I don't necessarily understand as much, but it's like it expands my horizons a bit. And just realizing how phenomenally difficult it would be, because it is so very concentrated in one thing. So something that might work in in the Commonwealth may work, but even then, the local contexts are different. On the other hand, have people done things akin to Revelation that do this kind of thing? Well,
Just to bring forth the purpose of
yeah.
his
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, I think it would be extraordinarily difficult because there's certain, like, for example, some of the images around the new heaven and new earth that we talk about next week. That is very firmly still very much recognized within a Christian sphere, but even then, a lot of the symbolism underneath that would have to, like, for example, what would we use today to have something that is symbolically the embodiment of chaos?
Mm-hmm.
That everybody would recognize as the embodiment of chaos.
Well, how about COVID?
Yeah, well, I mean, there
Yeah.
could be
It went around the whole world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But how would you describe, like a sphere with spikes on it, or like rolling down, rolling down, and rolling
With
over,
many
over
heads.
or
many heads.
or something like that, and that always seem to multiply. Yeah, I mean, there's an example very quickly here. We've actually created a symbol of that and like I said, the book and the movie that Ready Player One, that Ready Player One was based on, like the book and the movie are an example of a modern day use of apocalyptic literature.
Mhm.
But it's done so in the concept of a world of virtual reality where those symbols aren't just simply described, they're seen. And you have this story that is a mashup that layers many different images on top of each other. But the trouble is, in order to truly appreciate it, you almost had to have, like me, been a teenager in the 1980s. To have seen all of that. So I'm not necessarily I'm not necessarily sure where all that went. Now I think we've just lost Janice. But I think she may had to step away. But we are now at 8:30. So I'm just going to. So again, just as a reminder of next week, it is the last two chapters. And what I want you, again, it's this: do the comparison, read chapter 21 and 22, and then compare it to Ezekiel's description of the new temple in chapters 40 through 43, optional 44 in Ezekiel, just to see how it works, because there is a lot of Revelation is very reliant upon a lot of images from the Old Testament, and sometimes we can point it out, and sometimes it's a little more difficult. In this particular case, it's a little closer. You can actually say, okay, well, Ezekiel's description of this new temple, that was, as far as Ezekiel was concerned, was hypothetical. It was never something that was actually ever realized. It was just something that he described. And then we have Revelation, of course, then the new heaven and the new earth, and specifically the new Jerusalem. And we'll see where that goes. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So I'm gonna hit the just stop recording, and
Bye.